in the house. So give it up for Mitch Antisa.
Hello,
Hello.
everybody. Happy
You're
to
not
be
live,
here.
buddy. How are ya?
Hey, I'm good. Interesting.
Interesting.
So,
I mean, you do live
yeah,
streams anyway, so you're used to this thing, right?
yeah, that's true. That's true. I wouldn't say I'm the best live streamer on the planet. I've only recently started mixing things up with different screens, so
Oh,
still
fancy.
learning, but it's fun.
All
Yeah,
right. So
definitely.
today, actually, I was planning to pair you with another artist, but I think by with the work that you do is really like deserves a whole hour because it
Oh,
would be.
thank you.
It's very interesting the work that you do. Like for people that are not familiar with them, I'm gonna put it here on the website mantisa.xyz. It's it's weird. I mean, sorry, but it's just
No, no, it's
it's like
fine.
I don't know how to describe this. It's like a kind of uh, it's just you had a live called Getting Weird with the Mantisa.
Yeah, yeah, that
Yeah,
was the
it's
at the Blender conference a number of
really
years ago.
really nice, epic, and it's just weird. So I'm
Thank you.
curious to know about everything, but especially focus on the loops. You have a section on your website called VJ Loops where
Yeah,
you give away the you make the loops and you just give them away and they
yep.
loop great. If you've
Thank
seen
you.
it on Twitter, see them again because the compression probably killed them. So go to the website and download the actual files and the blend files for to play with
Yes.
this. So how did you even start making loops? How did you move into the loop?
I don't know. That's a good question. Honestly, I've never really thought about it that much. I've bounced around different parts. So I started as a visual effects artist about 10 years ago, and I did motion graphics and ArchViz, and I've done all kinds of stuff, but I always kept going back to just making weird stuff with VFX tools. And I don't know. I think after a while, I just decided I'm just going to go all in, just keep doing that and see where it goes. Um, and then I sort of discovered that it's actually it's a good style to mix for VJing and for doing loops for concerts or even music videos and other things or album covers. So I kind of rolled into it a little bit. And once I started making the VJ loops, I figured it would be a good way to kind of get artists' attention and the thing is, I love making stuff, and I don't really see the point if somebody else can use it that it just sits here on a hard drive. So I figured I'd just give them away and see what happens. And
Oh,
people have been, I've seen them, I've gotten like cool Twitter messages from all over the world of people like spotting them somewhere or using them at a show, and that's really fun because it's nice because that my work somehow gets used, but it's useful for everybody. So
it is really like because it's Creative Commons or CC0 even like public domain,
public domain.
public domain. So you don't even have to credit. That's
No,
the
because
what people
in a live show, it's hard to
hard to
credit
give
someone
credit.
if you're
Yeah.
using it. So I figured just public domain it, and most people give me credit anyway because they appreciate it, which is cool. But I've seen it at like music festivals with 100,000 people. I've seen it in the background somewhere. Somebody's using it at a DJ booth, so that's kind of cool to see
That's
your work sort
really
of spread in weird ways.
That's really cool. So today we are going to dive into some of this, or even make one from scratch. What do you think?
I don't know if we could do a full one, but I can definitely show you some cool tricks to do when it comes to looping stuff. Maybe loop some things that you might not think are possible.
Like, how do you like? Doesn't even look like a loop. I don't even know how long is it. Like sometimes it's like 10 seconds, but it doesn't really look like a loop. That's the
Yep.
beauty of it. How do you even start making a loop? So for that, I
Yeah.
think we can even maybe we can look at some of the files that you have uh, that you made, or we can start from scratch.
Yeah.
I think there are
I think
some questions already. Sorry, I think there are some
sure. Yeah.
questions,
Go for
but
it.
in case you are, if you missed it, it's on the description, or also go to blender.today, and I'm also sharing it here on the chat where you can ask questions. We have already a few comments already, 13 questions. So we're gonna get to it in a bit, but let's see how let's see the magic. What is it? How do you even start? Would you start by setting the length, or the length is something that you just come up with it while making it, or
Sure. I'll share my screen and
yeah?
I'll just dive into it. So let's see. Share Blender. There we go.
Nice.
There it is.
Okay. Blender, the latest Blender. You compile your own.
Lately, yes. The last year or so, I've been getting into it more. Just because it's fun and I wanted to learn how to do it, so it's kind of cool. So for this live stream, I've stripped away all of my preferences. So it's vanilla Blender. Usually, I've got it set up somewhat differently, but at least I can talk about some of the stuff that I do to make my work easier. So one of the things you can start with in your preferences is under animation, you can set your default interpolation to linear rather than Bezier. And that means all the animations you do won't actually have any curves on them. So if you loop them, they'll look like perfect loops.
Oh, you're changing the user preferences because we can't see those.
Okay.
Because it's in a different window. So you can open the editor maybe in the...
Yeah, where are we? User preferences.
There, yeah.
There we go. So here in the animation, you've got the default interpolation is usually set to Bezier. And I switched that over to linear because let's say I'm animating a camera through a tunnel and I want it to fly at the constant speed. I don't want to have to animate it and then go in and then change the curves every single time. So to alleviate that, I just switch it and then we can get started. So there's multiple ways to start things. Let's start with a very simple and fun exercise, which is the displacement modifier. There's so much cool stuff you could do with it.
Displacement
but
modifier.
I also, and I also like to work with as many modifiers as possible so I can easily go in and change variations. So for example, when you do tour visuals for a show, a lot of the artists will ask, hey, can we have this thing, but maybe 3 different versions where it just loops slightly differently or it moves slightly differently. And if you've got everything set up in modifiers, it's very quickly to just change a texture or something like that. So that's why I do this. So I'll just start with a square, but I'm going to turn it into a sphere, or a cube rather, and turn it into a sphere. So I'm going to drop on a subdivision surface and a cast modifier. Where are we? There we go. Set this to 1, and now I know this is a perfect sphere, and it's got nice polygons, so we can start doing some cool stuff with it.
So you need geometry to start with. Okay.
Yes, I work with a lot of geometry, a lot of heavy geometry. So I tend to not optimize a lot, just because I know I can set the modifiers to be ridiculously high during render time, and then just kind of figure it out in the viewport, let it render, and then look at it when it's done.
Could you make the text bigger? Sorry.
Yeah.
Yes.
Let's
like
go
1.5 or 1.4, 1.
Like this?
Yeah, that's much better.
All right, cool.
Thank you.
So, see what we can do. No worries. So all I've done is just, you can do this with a sphere as well if you really want to. I'm just showing how easy it is to manipulate this stuff. So first thing I'm going to do is set this to 30 frames a second, and let's say 300 frames. So usually it's between 10 and 20 seconds. Most of the loops I do are either 10, 15, or 20 seconds. And for most shows, it's either 30 or 60 frames. So I kind of adhere to that a little bit.
So you always set the length first.
Yeah, because that way I can just start animating and I don't have to worry about it. Sometimes I'll extend it, but usually I work at the length that I've set first, just to keep it simple. So let's throw in a texture and the displace. Distorted noise will forever be my favorite.
Of course.
That if it disappears, I don't know what I'm going to do.
And okay, so you deform.
Just deform it. So now you can mess with it, but to actually get it to loop properly,
that's a magic.
Yeah, that's kind of where the fun stuff happens. So I'm going to start with a circle, just a curve, and then I'm going to add in an empty. And this empty is actually going to control the coordinates of the displace. So in here in the displace, I can set the texture coordinate to object, and I can select the empty. And now when I move it around, you'll see the displace changes and it does fun stuff. But what I can do as well is now constrain this to that path. So that means the empty is going to follow around a perfect loop of a path. And that's kind of the trick to getting it to work. So if I set this to 0 for the first position, I'm going to animate it and then set not the last frame, but the frame after the last. Otherwise, you get a duplicate frame where the empty is in the same. Yeah. So the amount of times I have hit shift right arrow and then right arrow, I don't even want to know at this point.
You should make a script for that. So basically, the trick is that you make it. You drive everything from another object that does a perfect loop. So no matter what you attach to it, that's always going to be a perfect loop, basically.
Yeah. So now you can see it in the viewport as it's turning. It loops perfectly, and I don't have to worry about it. I could do stuff like use follow curve, and then I could animate the empty individually as well. So let's say I insert a single keyframe on the x-axis here, and then do 360 degrees on frame 301. Now it's going to turn with that.
Oh, so then you can attach that rotation to something else.
Yeah, or just keep rotating it in different axes.
But always in a perfect loop, the first and the last.
But always in a perfect loop. And now you get this really weird, whatever looking thing. I wish I could tell you half of the stuff that I make, what it actually is, but I don't even know half of the time when I'm making it because I like experimenting. And now that's it. Like you can start shading this, you can start lighting this. You can do all kinds of stuff with it. Another fun trick that you could do with this is, let's bring Suzanne into this, seeing that it is a Blender live stream. What I'm going to do is I'm going to parent her to the displaced object. And then in the displaced object, I'm going to turn on instancing. Now we have a whole bunch of Suzannes. A scaler by face sizes. There we go. I'm going to hide the original Suzanne here real quick so you can see what we're doing. Cube, Suzanne, there we go. Now if we turn off display and render instancer, now we've got a whole bunch of Suzannes doing funky stuff.
Nice. So YouTube compression will love this. So this
it's probably not super visible. So I'll drop down the subdivision level here so you can see a little bit better what's going on. Okay. And now,
sorry, duplifaces you're using.
Instances. They're not called duplifaces anymore.
Ah.
Sorry, I couldn't resist. But yeah, I still call them dupliverts and duplifaces a lot as well. But
instancing. I'm an old fart.
Yeah, no,
hypercurves.
Still make the same.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And the fun thing is, because this is now set up, I can just change the texture interactively while it's playing and see all the different effects. So that's what I really like about this kind of thing. It just allows you to mess around. And once you've got this set up, you can do whatever you need to do and just keep working.
Anything. Do you mix multiple loops? Like, for example, you can have this one going in like 300 frames, but then you can have another one going 600 frames. So you have multiple level loops.
Yeah, I'll usually do that when you get like UI elements that need to turn around or something, and then you can animate them at a quarter of the length, half of the length, and the full length. And then usually what I'll do is I'll use keyframe modifiers to have them just repeat or continue on.
Keyframe modifiers. Oh, like in the
curve
modifiers.
Yeah. So here, let's say I want to make this loop twice as long.
Yeah.
I could easily just change it to 600.
600.
And then in all of the different keyframes here, go into modifiers, add the cycles modifier, just to make it even more confusing.
Yeah.
And then I can either have it repeat or repeat with the offset. And if I now copy this one to the other ones, it's just going to keep looping infinitely. And because of that point is at frame 301, it will still loop at the same point. So let's say if we just keep going, I might turn off the instancing for a second so it's a little bit more visible in the viewport. Now you can see it just keeps looping perfectly, and it'll come back and loop again.
And even on the other way around too, you could have some loops going every 30 frames or every 60. Yeah. As long as it's a multiple, it's gonna work just fine.
Yeah, that's the only constraint you really have, is having multiples of the frame. So that's where working with like 25 or 30 frames per second is a little bit easier, because you don't get weird values like 96 frames or 120 frames.
Yeah.
You could just, it's like 30, 60, 90. It's a little bit quicker to calculate in your head.
As always. And in this way, do you move the camera? No, you keep all the objects. Moving the camera might break the...
It depends. Here, I can show you another example real quick.
I can imagine that if you move the camera and you're using some kind of screen like dependent effects, it might get a bit. I mean,
It's not
hard to
too
do.
bad because even with Eevee, you can loop stuff perfectly if you kind of know how to fudge it a little bit. So this is another really good example. If I do move the camera,
Yeah.
one thing if you want to get into making VJ loops that you'll see everywhere is tunnels.
Tunnels,
I
yes,
just
that is.
after all these years, I just keep making tunnels and I keep getting asked to make tunnels. So there's so many ways of doing it. Well, let's have some fun with it.
Yes.
So the first thing I'll usually do is actually animate the camera. So I have a fixed distance and I'll keep it simple for myself because that's what I started with at first. I would make something and then try to fly through it and then try to make it loop. But that just sets you up for failure because sometimes you've got objects that are like 3.7 meters long. So the camera has to travel in weird sort of lengths and it's hard to figure it out after the fact. So
Yeah.
what I do now is I'll just set a keyframe on the camera at the start, and then again, shift right and right to get to frame 301, and then set it to maybe 100 meters. So now, whatever I
Location in
do,
Y, yeah.
yeah, I know my tunnel is going to be 100 meters long, but that also means that I can put everything in a collection, use a collection instance, offset it 100 meters, and it will loop perfectly. So I'll do that and show how that goes. But collections are extremely useful for making loops, so it's really nice.
Because you add all the objects, you put them in a collection, and you basically instance the collection like the duplicate groups.
And yeah, exactly. And you get fast render times for free because it's an instance, so it's not having to recalculate the geometry multiple times, and it's always going to be the same. So you can even have something like an object affecting whatever it is that you're making, but the collection will be the same at the end of it again. So I'll just make one while we're talking to illustrate the point. So I'll start with the cylinder because we are making a tunnel after all. I'm gonna.
This is a 101. Tunnels.
Yeah.
Loop cut it a million times.
Yep. Cylinder mode. A bunch of buttons.
Do you have something in mind before making the loop, or do you design them first, or you just go and then
I just go with the flow. Yeah, I don't really know what I'm doing. Well, I know what I'm doing in terms of my actions, but I don't know what the end result is going to be.
Do you have clients asking for specific stuff?
Sometimes, but I've noticed the longer I'm doing this, the more freedom they give me. The more they just send me a mood board with like all these random things, and they're like, if it kind of looks like this, it's cool. So usually I'll pick like a color palette or maybe a pattern or something that I can focus on and work around. But even then, I try to experiment as much as possible. So let's try to get some layering in this tunnel. So I've got a solidify on here, and I'm not going to fill the rim, so I turn that off. And by adding a second solidify, I can actually get multiple layers of thickness in this tunnel. So I don't have to do anything extra. I don't have to model it. And again, it's down to being able to do extra things after the fact. Now, this is a trick that I've shown and used so many times already, but it still remains really cool. You can use a texture to drive a vertex group. So you can get a procedural vertex group without actually having to do the work, which is really nice. It requires to make one first. I'm going to call this mask really quick.
Yep.
And when I go into vertex weight painting mode, you can actually see what's going on. So I'm going to use the mask. And this is new to 2.83. This little checkbox. So if you're not using the beta yet, or the alpha or a version, it's coming.
Yes.
So if you turn this on, what it's going to do, it's going to invert the fall off type, but you'll see why that's useful in a second. And I'm going to turn on group add as well. So now what's happening is just filling the vertex group because we've set the fall off to invert, so it's completely full. And if we throw in a texture mask here, and again, distorted noise because it's so much fun. Because what's happening is now, the vertex group actually just gets propagated by the texture. So this is a dream for this kind of work because it means if I go back into object mode, I can now do things like use a mask modifier and throw in the vertex group. And now I get a broken up cylinder. Wow. So if we fly through this, this is already starting to look like a VJ loop.
Yeah.
And this is the basis for many things. But the cool thing is, because it's a vertex group, you can manipulate it after the fact or use other modifiers with it as well. And let's say if I copy this modifier, I'm just going to put another one after that. I'm going to call the second vertex group mask2. And I can have another vertex group on top of that doing something similar. Maybe have this one be smaller in size. And I could, for example, use it in a solidify modifier. So throw that in there, add in thickness. Now we're getting some really weird but interesting looking geometry.
But that's the whole point, right?
Yeah, it's just...
Did you see that there is, sorry, speaking about the solidify modifier, there is a new feature since a few days ago, actually. It was committed.
Yes.
When? Friday.
Shell and rim vertex groups. Yes.
Yes. I'm probably very excited about it.
Yeah.
So for people that don't know, here is Solidify modifier now has, since a few days ago, has a new option for assign the shell and the rim geometry to a selected vertex group. So I guess that's like a wet dream for you in this case.
Yeah, anytime anybody adds anything to vertex groups, I'm like, yes, more. The only thing I'm hoping that will someday happen, the only thing that could drive me to help develop Blender, I think, is being able to use vertex groups as a mask in cycles in shading. That would be amazing.
Mask and cycles shading.
Yeah, because you can use colors but not weights. But if you could use the weights, then you could use it for both modeling and shading, and you can get some really crazy effects. Oh. But that's just a pipe dream.
Well, so. I mean, Everything Notes should bring that to life.
Be able to do that kind of stuff. Yeah. I'm waiting patiently.
So, I mean, what if you just use a bitmap image? Wouldn't that also work? Like if you could use masks as a bitmap?
Yeah, it works. But then lose the link between the thing with the procedural textures is that they're 3D, so that I don't need UVs or anything.
Yeah. Good point.
We'll get there. It's all good. What it can do now is already amazing, so I'm not complaining at all. Having a good time. So I'm gonna add I'm just gonna split all these edges. It's split. I'm completely missing it.
Maybe you can search for it. Oh no, they renamed it. No, it was okay. It was edge. No, yeah. It didn't. It wasn't renamed. There was another one that got renamed. The extrude region. No, something with the region was renamed, and then it became edge and loops. It was only edges.
Okay. So I've edge split all these different parts now, and the reason is now they're all separate polygons being affected. But the cool thing with that is that if we now throw in something as smooth modifier, it's going to start trying to smooth those out and give you extra bits in between. And as you can see, the possibilities are endless. And I cannot tell you how many like happy accidents I've had over the years just messing with this stuff. And now it's doing something really weird.
That is really cool. So what is something that you need to take care of when working on a loop? Like try not to get things, like what is a don't when working on loops? Or everything is valid, just do it.
Yeah, no. It's the hardest part. I think the hardest part is figuring out the setup. Like I can make most things loop now. I can make particles loop. I can make cloth simulations loop. I can make anything mesh related loop pretty much. Now with the new VDB volumes, it's actually possible to make VDBs loop. But I still have to figure out the details of it. So with a bit of creativity, you can make pretty much anything loop. It's just you have to understand the limits before you start, because otherwise you're going to run into trouble. Like I said, if your mesh is like this weird shape or this weird length, and you have to get a camera to fly through it, and your whole setup is done. Yeah, that's why I try to keep it as procedural as possible, because you're going to have to fix something at one point, and if it's all sculpted and baked down and you have to redo everything, you're just going to hate yourself. So.
Yeah. Have you ever reached a point where you like messed with your loop and then you can't get it back or something?
Um, Before I do that, I'll just hit save as.
Yeah, good idea. Good idea.
Just to be on the safe side. But yeah, and there's so many things you could do. Like here with the camera, what I could do is I can animate it over the Y rotation axis as well, so that we
Oh,
get some circular movement. Now we get some really crazy looking things.
just keep doing this until your computer can't handle it anymore.
Basically, yeah.
For the rendering, what do you prefer, Eevee or Cycles for looping in particular?
It depends on the project, honestly. They both have their use cases, I found. I really like the reflections that Eevee gives me because you can do, if you want to do like cool reflective stuff really quickly, that works really well. For a lot of the tunnels, because I do my compositing in Blender afterwards as well, so I need some of the passes from Cycle sometimes. But with the new Eevee passes, I've been able to replicate some of that workflow as well. So it really depends on, for my personal work, what I feel like using. Sometimes I'll use one or the other. Like I've still got less experience with Eevee, so sometimes I'll just use Eevee because I want to learn more about it.
Yeah. Do you use other render engines outside of the two best ones?
Before I used Blender, I used other stuff. Like I used Mental Ray, V-Ray, Corona, but since I switched to Blender, I've tried some of the other open source ones, but
Lux.
Cycles and Eevee are so well integrated. There's really no beating it in Blender. So
yeah, I can imagine. Blender internal.
I use it maybe for like particle trails once or twice back in 2.7 days, but I started using Blender I think 5 years or so ago. So Cycles was already in there, and I was already using it from the start. But yeah. I've heard stories.
Blender, it's the best. I love Blender internal. So after this step, what would you do? We still have half an hour. We can. Are you okay staying until the end? By the way, just kidding.
Yeah. No, I'm more than happy to. I don't know. Maybe we could do
particles
questions after. Oh yeah, particles. That could be a fun one. I'll show one last thing here, just for the collection.
Particles or physics or like something weird.
So yeah, here I'm just instancing that collection, and because now I've set it to 100 meters, I can know I just have to offset it 100 meters, and then you'll see towards the end of the loop, and I'm going to skip through it here. You'll see that it just loops perfectly.
So you just the same the collection. You just added one like instance, Shift A instance collection.
Yeah, and then maybe duplicate it once or twice because. Yeah, or until like the hole at the back of the tunnel is small enough that you don't really notice. And then sometimes I'll use the camera clipping as well, so the end of where it's rendering stays consistent between the loops.
Or some mist.
Because if you look very closely, you can see here, I'm going to zoom in a little bit, that the end of the tunnel extends a little bit because the camera clipping goes further out.
Yeah.
But I know I've got 2 loops at the end, so that means I've got 200 meters. So if I set my camera clipping to, let's say 100, just to be on the safe side, now it's going to stay the same. And then in compositing, I'll add like a big glow or whatever to hide the fact that there's a bit of a hole there. And now you've got basically a perfect loop. Yeah.
Wow.
But we'll
particles.
We'll do some particles because that's always fun. And it uses some interesting parts of Blender as well.
Wow, yeah, and especially looping. There's nothing with less control than particles or physics, or how do you even? Yeah.
I get around it. Let me put it that way. There's 2 ways of doing it. One way which is a little bit more reliable, and the other which is a little bit more of a pain in the butt. So I'm going to go for the reliable way today, but I'll also talk about the other way to do it. So I'm just going to do something very simple. Actually, let's start with something. Just a sphere.
You have so many add-ons. Or it's just the one?
It's just the extra objects add-ons, actually. Those are 2 of the add-ons that I always immediately enable, just because they have a few extra cool objects that you can use. And I don't want to say I try to avoid modeling, but I'm not a very fast modeler. So if I can start with a good base shape, then that's always preferable.
Somebody on the chat today say that yeah, they learned that with you they learned that they can be crappy modelers and still make awesome stuff in the in a good way.
Yeah, of course.
In the way that you don't need to like model a hyper realistic something if you just make it glitchy.
Yeah, exactly. You can get away with a lot of stuff with like moody lighting or funky shading or things like that, and that's kind of the fun of it. So, first thing I've done, and this is usually in my own default file, I always leave gravity turned off because I like the way when you start messing with particles and forces without gravity, you immediately start getting cool shapes. So, let's just start with this, and I'm going to have it emit from frame 1 to frame 300. And let's say we'll give them a lifetime of 150 frames just to have something to start with. Yep. And then I'm going to have to adjust some settings here. So I'm just going to make them a little bit smaller. Something weird going on with my build maybe, so disregard that.
Particles?
Yeah, the
you
scale
build your own
of
Blender.
the...
You build your own Blender.
Yeah, but I wouldn't say I'm very good at it yet because I still get weird glitches sometimes, and it's more me than Blender. Because whenever I download the daily build from the website, it's like, it works in this one. So what am I doing wrong?
Well, the thing is that the Blender live stream, the Blender build bot has its own libraries built in, and when you compile it, it's using your own libraries.
Yeah, I use the pre-compiled ones now for CentOS, I believe. So that sort of solves the problem because I used to have a lot of issues with the libraries on my install, but I'll get there eventually. Like I said, it's a learning process and it's part of the fun. So see, I'm not going to give them any velocity, and I'm going to change
no velocity, so you don't want them to go.
No, I just want them to be affected by the force itself because we want to give them like a cool sort of interesting look here.
So you remove the velocity, so they're only affected by the force fields that you add.
Yeah, exactly. And what I do change as well is change the color from material to velocity so I can see which particles are going slow and which particles are going fast. And let's do 10,000 because I'm feeling adventurous.
Which graphics cards do you have?
I've got 4 graphics cards in this machine, so yeah, enough to do funky stuff.
Okay, must be very warm in there.
So let's just look at this. And a fun trick to use as well, if you want to have your turbulence change a little bit over time, I'm going to use a fixed size.
Yeah.
That way, kind of look at how big we want all of this to be. Let's see, like this maybe. Then, because I am a lazy person.
Yes, lazy for the win.
Yes. I'm going to use a driver to change the direction and speed of the force. But the drivers panel is great and all, but I like to just type #frame.
Yes.
And then divided by some arbitrary number. And this will give me random rotation on the force without having to do anything at all. So now the force changes over time.
Okay, so people who didn't get that, #frame or #frame means the current frame number. So in frame 50 is going to be 50, and it's a reliable way to add like a random, but not so random. It's actually like a seed.
Yeah, and the cool thing is you can divide it or multiply it by different values. So you can speed it up and slow it down. And because it's keyframe independent, let's say the loop has to be 600 frames, I don't have to change anything to it because it'll just keep going. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so we've got this simulation now, but how are we going to actually properly loop it? So the first thing we need to do is make sure that we're able to cache out all the particles for the whole extent of their lifetime. Okay. And this is something where And I only figured this out recently. I never knew what this little button down here was. I don't know if I can see it here. There's a little stopwatch next to your start and end frames in the timeline.
Yeah.
Yes, you can have an alternative timeline length. I did not know this until I think a few months ago, and it blew my mind because I've been changing the end of the timeline for so long.
No.
So I was really happy to find it.
But it's right there. No, it's
but I never clicked it, so I never really. I was like, yeah, whatever. It's
I think we need to maybe to work on the new icon or so.
Yeah. But the cool thing is now you can do your simulations without having to change the end of your loop or whatever. So I know, okay, I'm starting at frame 1, I'm ending at frame 300, and I've got a lifetime of 150. So I need 450 frames at least for all the particles to have simulated, to have come and gone. So I'm setting this to, let's say, 500 just to be on the safe side. And all I'm going to do is under cache, I'm going to bake this.
Yeah.
And it's baked. So now we just have our particles baked. You can scrub through them, whatever, and you'll see they'll disappear towards the end. Now, I want to do two things. I want to figure out a way to get this to loop properly, and I want to make sure that when the particles die, they don't just disappear, because it doesn't look good. It doesn't look quite as nice.
It loses the magic otherwise.
Yeah. So in usually when you're using particles and you're using particle instances, you'll go down to rendering it as an object or a collection. But if you want to loop them the easy way, you make the object that you want to instance over the particle system, and on that object, you use the particle instance modifier. So it's another way of looking at it, but it basically means that this is a mesh now that you could export and bring in and do stuff with. So
mesh. So you're
yes, I could export it as an Alembic cache and bring it back in. So that's sort of the trick to it. Now, one of the things by default, this particle instance is set to show the unborn and the dead particles. So we just want to show the ones that are alive. That's what we're going to do. And the other thing we need to do is use a texture in the particle system, of all things.
What is the point of using the texture? What brings it?
It allows you to map texture over the time or the age of the particle, which means you can use it for all kinds of things. For example, I'm just going to call this one scale. So I've added the texture in the bottom of the particles here. And I click the button to go over to that texture. And now if I set this to blend, and then if shit,
it's everything.
Really no problem.
All right, so I'm going to switch.
welcome everybody. Thanks so much for joining our webinar today. I'm Galen from Quixel here. I'm an evangelist here at the company.
And hi, I'm Teddy Bergsman. I'm director of Quixel at Epic.
Today, we're going to be covering a couple different things for you guys. We're going to start in the early days of Quixel, go over some of the history. We're going to cover all of our current offerings today, and then give you guys a little bit of a glimpse into some of the things that are happening in the future. So, Teddy, why don't we start with a little bit of an introduction for each of us? So, why don't you go ahead and start?
Sure. So, my background is in 3D graphics and system engineering. I worked in the AAA games industry for 5 years, developing 3D scanning hardware and texture automation software before starting Quixel almost 10 years ago now, together with Vakar Azim. And today at Epic, as director of Quixel, I'm responsible for the success and vision and goals for our scanning missions.
And then I've worked personally as an environment artist in the games industry, a senior art lead, and worked on a couple different games like BioShock, Borderlands, Evolve, some Star Wars games, and the most recent God of War. And as an evangelist at the company, primarily my job is to obviously evangelize the product, speak to all of our existing clients, and also speak with teams that might be looking to potentially leverage Megascan's technology across all the different verticals that we work inside. So, Teddy, why don't you tell us a little bit about the history of the company?
Sure. So, around 10 years ago, Vakar and I, we left the games industry to build what we wanted to become the world's largest scan library. And that was to help artists get access to very high quality content that typically was only available to really large studios within the games and film industry. And to build that content library, we figured that scanning would be the way to go to produce the highest quality, most photorealistic content. But seeing as there were no off the shelf scanners back then, we decided to build our own. Now, building scanners is something that I've been passionate about since a kid, essentially. And I built scanners all through my teens. And Vakar was also a big mechatronic nerd. And luckily, we found each other, and together we built the first hardware prototype that came to lay the foundation for the Megascans library. Now, the first prototype was a big, scary box, and it got us into a lot of trouble. We were held at gunpoint at one time, and overall, it was just a very intimidating device. But over the years, this technology has significantly been streamlined. With every new trip, we bring back feedback to our hardware teams, and the hardware is becoming smaller, more portable, lightweight, easier to operate. And today it's a handheld device. And we build these scanners simply so that we can create the highest quality content possible. But building these prototypes and scanners and teams to scan all over the world is not an inexpensive endeavor. And so we had to fund that entire operation. And to do so, I wrote a number of tools for artists to help streamline the texturing process. So one of those tools was Endu, which allowed you to create normal maps straight in Photoshop. For instance, taking a photograph and turning it into a 3D material, or using selections and brushes and vectors inside of Photoshop to convert them to normals in real time. And this was generally a much faster workflow than modeling something by hand in a 3D software just to bake down a 2D map. Here you would actually be in 2D the entire time, and you would have real-time control over your results. Now, we were very lucky to see a small community form around this tool, and it helped us create even more art tools, one of them being Dido. And together we called this suite of tools the Quixel Suite. And it was focused on just automating and streamlining the texturing workflow for artists straight in Photoshop. So, for instance, introducing the Smart Material, which allowed you to automatically texture any 3D object with very realistic results, because we actually based these materials on the very earliest version of the Megascans library. So you would have scan-based wear and tear, you would have real-time 3D painting, plus the real-time normal editing capabilities of Endu, all within one singular texturing workflow.
And obviously, this time in the industry is very near and dear to my heart. This tool set came out at a very important time for me as an artist, and I immediately knew this was something I needed to add to my tool belt. So it was a really awesome time too, because this was actually when Teddy, you and I met for the first time digitally, but we were pen pals of sorts over Polycount, and you were sending me early builds of both Endu and Dedo, and I would eventually go on to do a contest with Quixel as well, and that was just a ton of fun early on in my career. So the original vision for the library was that of a digital prop house. In Hollywood, creators can drive to these massive prop houses, fill U-Hauls with everything they possibly need to shoot their film, and effectively the Megascans library is a digital version of that. We have a wide offering in the library in that we offer not only surfaces, but 3D assets, atlases, decals, vegetation, and everything in between. Really, when we go to an ecoregion to scan, we're getting everything that we can really get our hands on, be it the largest cliff wall down to the smallest rock, twig, leaf, and branch. And while the Megascans library is the cornerstone of what we'll be discussing today, we also have other components in Bridge and Mixer that we'll be covering briefly here today in this talk.
So Bridge is a content management system and it allows you to export assets straight into Unreal with a single click. Mixer is a texturing tool that allows you to 3D paint assets, create surfaces, stylize things, combine procedurals with scan data, and so much more. So today, Quixel is a team of 150 people with scan teams spread across 6 different continents, scanning content every single day in any type of environment you could imagine. From glaciers to jungles to savannas to temples, we really want to bring you all of the content that you could possibly imagine.
So at the beginning of last year, we set out to do something that we've actually never done before, which is create a high-quality cinematic using all Megascans assets inside of Unreal Engine. The cinematic was predicated on an entire scan trip to Iceland that was actually a month long. Our scan teams went out in some of the worst possible conditions for several weeks, and they came back with some of the most diverse and interesting ecoregions that we've ever captured inside of the Megascans library. And what we set out to achieve was create a photorealistic environment in cinematic with a very, very small team all running in real time in Unreal Engine. And one of the things that was really exciting about working on this project specifically was that we had game-focused artists that were actually working in coordination with VFX level supervision. And this allowed us to really create an awesome synergy between the two industries, pull and learn from each other in a new and exciting way here using real time as the vessel. And one of the exciting outcomes of working on this demo was that it brought us very close with Epic Games. We were able to interface with their teams across many steps of the way, and in working with Epic Games on this project specifically, it became very clear to us that our visions were very much aligned in making the best technology and tools available to literally anyone. Epic has been focused on multiple industries for a long time, and what's exciting now being a part of Epic Games is that we are helping champion that convergence. And it has been exciting to contribute even more to the industries like automotive, which have very particular needs as far as content is concerned, with elements that are based truly in the real world on physical products. For each of these verticals, removing as much of the guesswork as possible is essential for creating these high-quality renderings. And in working closer with each of these industries, it's been exciting to see these teams rely more on a library of assets to where they remove a lot of the guesswork for the work that they are doing. And as part of Epic Games, we're really excited with what the team at Twinmotion is doing now. we're actually collaborating very closely with them in revitalizing some of the content that was making up the original Twinmotion library, and we'll be expanding that effort in the coming months. Another exciting vertical that Epic has been spearheading is the film initiative, and it's been incredibly exciting to be a part of this in providing content for demos such as this, which we did for SIGGRAPH of last year.
And this new workflow is called virtual production. And virtual production essentially fuses traditional filmmaking with real-time workflows to allow for a next generation of entertainment, fueled by the digital prop house that is Megascans.
So we've also created a really easy way for users to browse the Megascans library in Bridge. And as you can see here, you can browse with collections or search features using names and keywords. But ultimately, the idea with this application is very simply to make it incredibly simple to bring assets into Unreal Engine. So as you're seeing in these really simple examples on screen here, I'm exporting a whole slew of assets, and with just a single click, my shaders, my LOD chains, and everything is set up, and I can just start being creative immediately inside of my scene.
Mixer allows you to take creative control over the entire Megascans library by defining your own style, and you can create endless variations of any single asset within the library.
And one of the big updates that we've made to Quixel Mixer just within the last couple weeks actually is full 3D functionality. Now we can paint either an existing Megascans library asset, or you can bring in your own custom asset like we're showing here. Stylization is also a really important aspect of what we're hoping to achieve with Mixer, and bringing in a physically based scanned photorealistic asset and maybe making it look like something that could fit inside of Fortnite is something that is now entirely possible using this tool.
As you can see, this is not very photoreal looking, but we've actually leveraged a lot of the Megascans library and turned it into stylized assets using Mixer. So this is a work in progress, but let's look at some of the techniques that we use to create some of these assets here in the scene. So imagine you have this Megascans asset, or maybe an asset that you've even scanned on your own, or something that you've sculpted in ZBrush. Now, you can leverage the Megascans library to completely transform the look of this asset and maybe fit it into a different type of biome. But with Mixer, you can also take it even a step further by defining your own unique style. And this is what we see here. So here's a smart material preset that we've created using Mixer that transforms any scanned asset into something that looks a little bit more painterly. So here's another example where we've taken the scanned wheelbarrow and transformed it into something much more vibrant and painterly. And now this retextured asset would make much more sense in a stylized scene like the one we just saw. And so we're working to extend Mixer with more functionality to allow you to stylize assets in this fashion, also adding many more smart materials that ship for free with the software.
And again, drawing back to our original experience in developing Quixel Suite, smart materials are one of the most important elements of this release, in that we really want users to very quickly be able to make some simple modifications and retexture an asset incredibly fast.
On top of that, we're working to bring multiple texture set support and UDIM support to Mixer in the next big release.
Let's take a really simple example of what Mixer can do here, and I'm going to create a very simple tiling material. As you can see, I'm able to browse the full Megascans library in the same way that we were browsing Bridge earlier. And for this specific example, I'm going to use a height-based blend to bring some dirt into some of the cracks and crevices of this existing wooden plank texture. We also have some pretty cool asset types. An atlas here is what I'm going to be drawing on for this specific example. And I want these leaves to actually be setting in some of the cracks and just breaking up the surface a little bit more than what we have before. And as you can see, I'm just feathering the threshold slightly in order to bring some of these elements into the range that I'm looking for. And the same applies here for this simple pebble texture. And the next thing I'm going to do here is actually bring this distressed wood and bark texture into this asset. And this will just sort of give it a little bit of a breakup on the surface. And lastly, I'll go ahead and just add in some simple puddles here on the surface to where we can actually get some really nice reflections once we bring this into Unreal Engine. And as we were touching on before in the bridge section, it's really important for making sure that it is easy to bring assets directly into Unreal Engine. So as you can see here, I just with a single click was able to export the mix and the variation of what I just made in Mixer. And I'm going to start painting a really simple blend using a Vertex blend material here inside of the engine. Now, one of the things that's really cool about this is that I'm able to obviously paint either a clean and simple version of the texture and mix that with a distressed and more beat up version of this texture and do that live here inside of the viewport. Now, I'm using the Megascans material that ships with our plugin, but it's important to note that if you're using your own master material for your project, you can actually use that master material as the input to have all of your shaders be hooked up automatically. All you need to do is just delineate each individual input, be it albedo, roughness, normal, displacement, or what have you, and you can construct these shaders very quickly with a single click just using Bridge and the Megascans plugin inside of the engine. So while we're here in the engine, why don't we go over the Megascans plugin in case you guys haven't seen it before. Now, as you can see here, there's a couple simple checkboxes that are automatically on. The first one here is the auto-populate foliage painter, and what this does is for any scatter debris or any elements that you might look to add as like vegetation into your level, those can actually be indicated to go directly into the foliage painter. This allows you to drop in a huge amount of plants and leaves and whatever you're going to be scattering in your scene and have that directly dropped in so you don't have to go from the content browser and drag that content back in. On top of that, if you see below here, this is the enable LOD setup, and what this will do is will allow you to actually have a LOD chain set up for anything that you have downloaded. And what's super convenient about this obviously is that since everything in the Megascans library is LODed from LOD 0 all the way through LOD 5, as well as an included cinematic high master mesh, you can actually have Unreal automatically create that LOD chain for you. As long as you have the existing inputs here to be able to create that chain, all you need is to be able to select inside of Bridge the correct LOD for your target mesh, and then all the other meshes that will go below it that you have downloaded will actually go directly into your LOD chain. And just to illustrate this point, I've pulled up the military water bottle that was used to set dress this scene. And as you can see here on import, I was able to get all my different LODs and everything set up by default. Now the only thing I need to do after this is actually just indicate at what distance I want each LOD to switch. Prompt before batch import does exactly what you would think it would do. The enable displacement checkbox is here, which will allow you to, on any surface that you're going to be using displacement maps, you can actually indicate this, and when you turn up the tessellation on an object, you'll actually get that undulation from the displacement maps. Apply to selection is very simple in that if you have a surface that you're exporting from Bridge, you can actually have objects in your scene selected, and that will apply it on import. And then if you indicate that you want to import master material textures, this will take away any elements that you don't have for your material, like curvature or ambient occlusion or anything therein. You can also override your various materials here on a per object basis, or per asset type rather, so you can say for a 3D object, I can say this is the master material that I want, indicate it here from my level, and as long as everything is named correctly, all the different inputs will go directly into the shader that you indicate here. Same applies for surface master materials, and plants are also here as well. They're obviously a little bit different of a setup than what you would have for a regular surface, in that there's some subsurface scattering to take into consideration, and just a couple of the features that really make vegetation shine. And lastly, the create material blend, which I just demoed in the previous frames. This is the ideal way to work with Megascans in conjunction with Unreal Engine. We support all the different engine versions that you might see, and now that we're a part of Epic, we'll be a lot more proactive in actually getting these plugins ready to go for subsequent versions of the engine. Real quick, I'd like to show you guys the master material that ships with the plugin, and as you can see here, it's very simple. We didn't want to overcomplicate this in that we really wanted just to give the users enough features to be able to maybe make some simple edits to their meshes or surfaces or vegetation upon import. And here's an instance for one of those assets after having gone through the process of being imported into our scene. As you can see here, I can change the tiling values, maybe offset the UVs in U or V coordinates. I can change the albedo tint, maybe indicate whether or not it's actually metallic. And then obviously, roughness and normal intensity are super useful for just dialing in exactly the look of the asset once you've dropped it in. If there are any other features you guys would like to see that we could ship with our next version of the plugin, definitely feel free to drop us a comment or a question here at the end of the webinar. And like we mentioned before, now that 3D functionality is inside of Quixel Mixer, one of the things that you can do here very quickly is bring existing Megascans materials and assets and manipulate them slightly in order to maybe ground them a little bit more in my scene. Now, for the scene that we were just working inside, I want to take this jerry can and make some very simple modifications to it. In grounding the asset, maybe have some mud and some sand build up on the top. And what's really cool about this is that I'm, again, using all Megascans materials in order to just very quickly make a variation of this asset that fits more inside of the scene that I'm working inside. I'm also bringing in some simple imperfections and just adjusting the contrast on this albedo as well. Because again, I really want just to ground this asset a little bit more into what it is that we're working inside. And of course, now just bringing it into our scene, as you can see, with just a single click, I've got this jerry can into my scene, and it's just so much more grounded than it was before.
So we have a lot of content in the making right now, and I thought I'd show you some of the scan trips that we went on to create these assets. Right here, we see an Arctic environment in the north of Sweden. One of the most highly requested materials in the Megascans library is snow. And so we went here for a couple of weeks to scan basically any type of snow you could imagine, both as surfaces and 3D assets. We also scanned an old abandoned mansion, straight out of a horror movie, essentially. Some cave systems, old derelict abandoned factories and industrial sites, abandoned hospitals. And if you're an avid user of the Megascans library, you